This was a picture out of China last year. I think it was Beijing province. That was heavily impacted by a major ice storm. The rest of the pictures were absolutely incredible if you had a chance to have a look at those. But clearly, ice storms, all bets are off. Most infrastructure, the higher the accumulation, the more significant the damage. Only the people in the east have lived through the issues related to the multiple collapses of transmission towers that looked like they were matchsticks, created matchsticks during that period of time. It's difficult to look at what has to be done in terms of the engineering changes required to a transmission system that would have to undertake substantial change to be able to withstand the amount of ice that potentially could build up. What kind of risk is associated with change at this point in time in climate change that would allow us or require us to go back and revisit our engineering standards on some of the transmission towers to be able to make that change? Similar to major snow events, similar to wind events, there's not a lot of value in sending our crews out in a windstorm. Most of the time what we end up doing is waiting till we get the majority of the way to the tail end of a windstorm before you see too many of our crews moving out. There's not a lot of value in sending them out to start repairing something when the damage isn't even finished yet. So when you talk about storm systems, ice storm systems in particular, similar to that of snow, we have also the added concern related to the safety of our crews. And maybe, Alan, do you remember how long it was before they started putting crews out on the street after the ice storm?
It took at least a week before we could really do anything. First week was, actually I remember because the Army came in, and for the first week, the Army was there, and we had to feed them and take care of them. No, we did. They did municipalities, but they were just sitting there waiting. We had nothing we could get them to do. So yeah,
So it was very much a perilous effort to step outside of your home or your business during that time frame. Putting people back on the street when A, the damage isn't done, and secondly, you're putting your workforce at risk. Obviously, has to enter into the discussion.
Were they helping people cross the road?
I'm sorry?
Oh, they were. Yeah, they were doing little things here and there.
I think the general message at that point in time was not to go outside, period.
Yeah.
Unless there was a life safety requirement for you to do so. And again, it goes back to the comment that was made earlier. If you saw the pictures are absolutely stunning. And I think a lot of people just simply wanted to get out and experience what was going on in the environment around them, not really understanding the critical risk that existed at that point in time.
I could comment just so you know that the Weather Service, whose big supercomputer is in Montreal, was one of the few organizations that never missed a beat because we had backup diesel generators, which in fact a year earlier the government had told me to get rid of it because obviously an unnecessary redundancy. I didn't, not because I knew it was an ice storm there.
Well,
Business continuity.
and that's interesting. Currently, there is a program with Con Edison in New York, and they're working with IBM. Is anybody familiar with this? They are looking to predict micro impacts of systems, and they're down to a kilometer square grid in terms of what the impacts of those systems are. So it allows for much better modeling from an electric utility standpoint to actually determine, based on the forecasts, which turn out to be very, very accurate, and allows them to actually start modeling in very small areas what the actual damage. And with that, we can make a determination of how many crews, the types of resources, the types of damage that we're going to sustain, types of material that might be available to us.
Nova Scotia Power is currently working on that type of a system to predict, depending on the season and the reason and how much tree pruning they have or have not done, where those magic thresholds are, where they're predicting I need this type of pruning down to resources, I'm on the vehicles, and my damage will be this type of distribution, it'll be transmission,
right,
or it'll be the towers, or it'll be the poles, and trying to get the resources in advance. So they're just budding. It was presented at a very recent meeting of the Canadian Electrical Association, and the work that they're doing. So it's starting.
Well, and I think actually that's been around for a while now. A number of utilities have been employing those kinds of modeling up until this point. But I think what's interesting with the IBM is the supercomputer comment that really it's only these agencies that have access to these supercomputers that can do the type of modeling down to 1 square kilometer and be accurate to the degree that they are. That's really starting to look at the changes that are available. So this is the next generation of that modeling where a number of us have been working on those kinds of things. And a lot of the modeling currently in terms of wind speed, direction, leaves on, leaves off, you know, in terms of those models do provide reasonable predictions. But when all of a sudden your weather information changes and you see a change from an increase of even 10, 15, 20 kilometers an hour, that's a substantial difference. If you also now tell us that a system that was due to clear in a 4-hour time period is now going to be on the ground for 6 to 8 hours, again, all our models are shot at that point in time. It's the increased predictability and reliability on that information that's so very interesting with this partnership that's being worked with Con Ed and IBM at this point. And they've got several universities that are working on that as well, and I'd have to get you that information. It's interesting. Oops. Go back. It's interesting that when we look at the types of storms, you know, that matter to us within the hydroelectric utility, this is because our population is in the Lower Mainland, and this is storm season for the Lower Mainland of British Columbia all the way through to about January, end of January into February in some cases. And so we have a tendency, and this goes back to the discussion in emergency management of all hazard risk, is as a hydroelectric utility, because you know our population is here, we have a tendency of focusing on storms in the Lower Mainland. However, having said that, you talk to our folks in the central interior and the north, this isn't storm season for them. Okay? They get storms through, and in fact, this particular wind event, I believe, is predicted to impact 75–85% of British Columbia, which is unusual. It's very similar to the November 12th last year, the water boundary all the way through to the Alberta boundary picked up, and we had a lot of impacts as a result of that. But when you talk about the storms that typically the north and the central interior and southern interior recognize, it's related to the thunderstorms. Those for them are the ones that have the bigger impact, and those are tied to things like damage to transmission lines, damage to our distribution assets, and also damage as a result of fires that threaten both of those, as well as, in some cases, our dams and generation stations. So historically, just in the last year, I have this very short time frame in terms of reference with BC Hydro. So last year in July, heading into the August long weekend, we had a threat on what we call a radial feed transmission line, which is one path of electricity into 2 communities, Nekasavan and New Denver. And we had about, didn't know what the notice period was, but it turned out it was about 3 days worth of notice that there was a threat to the transmission line that serviced both Nekasavan and New Denver. As a result of that, and this is new for an electric utility, we sat down, assessed the risk, and said, you know what, we should be talking to our customers. And the first response within the organization was, why would we want to panic anybody? And it was a deep breath on my part as we sat down and said, okay, the idea would be that we communicate with the emergency managers in those communities and let them know that there is a risk so that they can activate some of their preparations that they already have in place, ensure that their plans are in place. This is a different type of event than perhaps they're used to. They have a high number of tourists that will be in the area. Likely they probably don't have an awful lot of excess hotel space. If we give them a heads up on this event, it may be something that might help in their planning. So we agreed that this would be a good test to find out if there really was some value in this. And then I went away to France for holiday for a month. So I didn't hear about the residual effects of this until later on. But what had ultimately happened was we got 3 days warning. And by the way, somebody had mentioned something about these events actually occurring. We as emergency managers really do like to see these things land periodically because you get to sort of do the happy dance and all really sorry for that. But yes, if we got all our and so what we ended up with was 3 days notice to 2 communities that they were potentially at risk of losing their power, but gave them some time to do something with it. And then it happened. We lost the line. and it was only gone for 2 days. I was really impressed with the amount of time it took us to restring those lines and get them back up. That was 2 days in a very hot spell in the southern interior of British Columbia. It allowed for them to make their plans in place, and ultimately the response back from all the politicians was, well done. We were able to make some use of that. So that was a positive learning for BC Hydro, to be able to let go of a little bit of information, and BCTC as well, because they're our transmission partner, and communicate out in advance and really see what the benefit of that was. Now the concern was, well, what happened if it hadn't burned through the line? Well, again, from our perspective as emergency managers, it's a test of our plan. You dust it off, you do a few things, you get it organized, nothing lost. Yeah, coffee, that's right. And so from that standpoint, you know, in my view, the discussion about making sure that we start to activate these resources and provide that information earlier on has a lot of benefits associated with it.
She did about 3 minutes.
We're almost done. Another slide from Alan Chapman. His suggestion is that we're already at that time where we're starting to see the impacts of climate change, a projection from 2006 to 2050.